Great. I was just going to wonder about that. Cool. Thanks, Denise. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good Friday morning. I was going to talk a little bit about the weather forecast for not just today and this weekend, but for 2016. How about that? Yes, this is not your 7-day forecast. This is like your 360-day forecast coming up. But I'm going to be speaking in general terms. All of us remember 2015, what an amazing year of weather this was. We really did live through history here in Austin. The amazing amount of rain that we had in May, and then we went into drought during the summer, and then we went back into floods in the fall, and just all the different kind of weather we saw in between. It was just phenomenal. There's really no other way to put it. So is 2016 going to match this? That's a good question. I'll be talking a little bit about that today. So anyway, we're living through history right now with the kind of weather we've been having around our area. Well, I wanted to talk first a little bit about drought. I think all of us have been very familiar with drought here for the last few years because we've been in almost a 5-year drought that's been gripping our area. Finally ended back in May. And what you're seeing up here in the slide right now, this is a time series. Take it back to 2007. And this is looking at drought across all of Texas. And this is very similar to the drought monitor as far as the colors go, where the lightest colors, like the yellow, mean either abnormally drier or the mildest forms of drought. Then you get into the very deep reds, and that's the most severe portion of the drought. And then on the y-axis going up is where you're seeing the percentage of Texas that has been in drought during that period, that time period. And if many of y'all might remember, 2007 was a very wet year. It rained a whole lot through the spring and even all the way into July. And that really did end the drought across Texas. So you will see that sort of dip where all the colors go away, started in the summer of 2007, continued into 2008. But then drought came right back at us. And if you remember, 2009 was a really bad drought year in our area. And not only here, but across much of the state as well. And you can see that in the colors there. And then as we finally got to late 2009, 2010, we had another El Nino develop. And many of you might remember that it did produce quite a bit of rain. We just about ended the drought statewide. Didn't quite, but almost did. In our area, the drought did end. But then we went into late 2010, 2011. I think all of us remember that period. That's when this big drought really did start across our area. I think many of us who have been around this part remember the summer of 2011 in particular, how it was just day after day of 100-degree heat. And there was no rain, hardly any rain to speak of. We were so dry that spring, and it was dry going into the fall. It was weather conditions that I don't think anyone around this area had ever seen. And that really kicked off this drought that persisted through 2012, 2013, 2014, and even into early 2015. But then the rain started in last spring, if you remember, and then by the time we got to late May, the drought had pretty much ended all across the state. In fact, the state climatologist said by the second week of July of this past year, the drought had ended statewide. First time in about 5 years, we were finally drought-free. But then as typical of Texas weather, you wait 1 minute and it's going to change, right? And certainly did. As we got to July, we had 0 rain. We had almost no rain in August, only about 1/3 of an inch. And we didn't do much better in September, and drought quickly came back. If you notice on the right-hand side of the screen up there, that you do see that spike coming back statewide where we started going into drought there for about 3 or 4 months. But then, if many of you might remember, late October, the rains came back. El Nino finally resurfaced again, and we started getting those generous rains around our area, which finally started to squish this drought. If you notice on the very right-hand side now, all the colors are gone. We are now drought-free statewide and in the Austin area for sure. This was a graph of Austin rainfall from 2015, and I mentioned what a crazy year this was for our area. If you notice, January, we did really well with 5 inches of rain. We got to February and got only 1/2 inch of rain. We got to March, had almost 5 inches of rain again. But then we got to April and 2.3. Overall, not too bad as far as the good start to the year. Then we got to May, and we had 17.5 inches of rain. Amazing. That's the wettest month that we have ever seen around this area. 8.89 in June when we had a tropical storm come through. And then we went to 0 in July. So, from one extreme to the other extreme. 0.35 in August, like I mentioned, and September was only 189. Then we got to October, 1185. I mean, how do you reconcile this? You know, most of us think that we get generally around 2 to 3 inches of rain per month. But man, not in 2015. It wasn't anywhere close to being evenly distributed. November was a pretty wet month for us, and then rain started to come down a little bit in December, but we still got 3 inches of rain, which isn't bad for the month of December. Some stats I put together for 2015. It was our second wettest year ever, with records going back to the late 1800s. The official total at Camp Mabry was 59.96 inches of rain. That's just amazing. Again, I mentioned second place. The wettest year ever was back in 1919. They had 64.68 inches. So we weren't too far from that. I mean, and that is way out there. This area never really sees over 60 inches of rain. We were really close to that this year. As far as the record books go, it was the wettest January through June on record. We had 39 inches of rain by the time we got to the end of the June, the first half of the year. That's just crazy. It was our 8th wettest June on record, 5th wettest October on record. And for the Austin Bergstrom Airport location, it was their wettest year ever. They had a rainfall total of about 58.5 inches of rain, just a little bit under what Camp Mabry reported. And as far as temperatures go, you know, last year with all of the rain, it did help hold our temperatures down just a bit. If you remember some of the previous years, 2012, 2013, were really, really hot. The average temperature for the year, about 69.8. It was 0.4 of a degree above normal. And again, that's the average for the year. That's if you add up all the high temperatures, all the low temperatures, that's what it came out to be. Ended up being our 20th warmest year on record. Previous to that, if you look back at 2012, 2009, all of those were up there in the top 10. So we did come down just a little bit on temperatures. As far as 100-degree days go, you know, it was a pretty bad August, I guess you might put it that way. The whole summer wasn't that bad. We ended up with 22 100-degree days. And the extremes in temperatures last year ranged from 23 degrees back last January, was our lowest temperature, up to 105. That was on August 12th. So we did have a pretty good range of temperatures last year. And of course, this year we haven't been anywhere near 23 degrees so far. In looking back at 2015, you know, one of the months that stand out the most is the month of May. This is the amount of rain that fell across the state, which was just phenomenal. You know, we were extremely wet here, but so were most areas of the state. I've just never seen anything like this. If you see all the color of purple up there, that's anywhere between 10 and 15 inches of rain for just that one month. And anywhere where you see those specks of white, that's more than 20 inches of rain. Notice from Dallas-Fort Worth area going up into Oklahoma, there was a lot of white on the map. You might remember the big floods that happened out around Wimberley. You can see down there in southern Blanco County a lot of white from more than 20 inches of rain. And even parts of Travis County, if you can see Travis County on there, had some specks of white. Same thing around the Houston area as well. Just amazing. This is the rainfall departure from normal. How much wetter than normal were we in that month? And for many areas, it was more than 12 inches above normal. Some spots even more than 16 inches above normal. That's just crazy. It was a great way to break the drought, and there was no doubt that the drought was finally ending once these rains set in across our area. By the way, speaking of that May, it was the rainfall average statewide a little over 9 inches, 9.06. It was the wettest May on record, wettest month ever recorded, the wettest spring on record, and the wettest January through June on record. This is statewide. So again, this is very telling of how you end a drought with something like this. And like I mentioned, after May came June. We still stayed wet with many areas seeing anywhere between 3 and 6 inches of rain. Great way to start the summer. It's just too bad that didn't continue. So, you know, looking back again at last year, I'm just kind of doing a quick review of 2015, and then I'm going to start looking forward. Once we got past June, it's like, man, somebody just turned the switch. You remember that? This big area of high pressure built in over Texas and just planted itself there, didn't really want to move until about the second half of October. And as long as that high sat there, we remained really warm and for the most part dry. Like I mentioned, that we didn't really see much rain at all during August or even September. It really took to the latter half of October to finally get the storm systems to move into our area. This was the amount of rain we saw from July 1st through the middle of October. And if you can see on the colors on there around Travis County, many places only saw less than 3 inches of rain. That's just really low. And if you see that area of red out to the west over the hill country, those are some spots that never even saw an inch of rain during almost that 3-month period. That's just crazy dry. Going from that crazy wet to that crazy dry, it just, you know, it really makes your head spin. But then late October, we had that big rain event when a storm system came through and part of the thunderstorm stalled just to the south on the south side of Austin down into Hays County, and many areas saw between 10 and 15 inches of rain in one day. That's crazy. That area where you see the purple in southern Travis County from right around the Austin airport going south toward Lockhart and Luling, and then going southwest over toward Wimberley and down into toward the New Braunfels area. All that region saw between 10 and 15 inches of rain. The I-35 corridor in general saw anywhere between about 5 and 10 inches of rain. Just a really crazy rain event. And don't forget that there was some severe weather in that as well with some tornadoes. So really, really crazy. This is what the 2015 rainfall looked like statewide using the color scale, and the legend is on the right-hand side. If you notice around the Austin area, Travis County, going southeast, most areas were in the red, which was anywhere from at least 40 up to 50 inches of rain. I know you can't see the detail on that, but many locations were even more than 50. You know, like Austin in particular had about almost 60 inches of rain. Many areas seeing between 50 and 60 inches of rain. When you go to the west, out across the hill country, it wasn't nearly as wet. You see most of the colors there being in the yellow, about 25 to 30 inches of rain. And the reason I point that out is has to do with that's the watershed to the Highland Lakes, our water supply for the city of Austin and many areas around this area. And while we did have some pretty good rains and did finally create some inflow into our lakes, the rainfall there wasn't nearly as heavy. I mean, had we transposed 50, 60 inches of rain out into the hill country, we would have had big floods coming through Lake Travis and down into the Colorado River. Notice the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Houston area was phenomenally wet. Notice that they were over 70 inches of rain for the year, just really wet. The Panhandle also did pretty well. West Texas also did really well. If you look at the rainfall departure from normal, you can really see the areas that stood out being so wet. All along the coastal plains, notice all the purple there, locations about 20 inches above normal. Same thing just to the north of Dallas. But look at the hill country. Totals ended up being more or less near normal. You see that you're seeing more or less tan there, which is, if you look at the scale, more or less near normal on the rainfall. Part of that had to do with had a very dry start to the year, and then once they did start getting those rains, it wasn't until the latter part of the year itself. So overall, though, a very good year of rainfall for Texas. By the way, as of right now, our soil moisture is in really good shape around this part of the state and really across all of Texas. If you see the green up there showing that we have quite a bit of moisture in our soil, not only at the surface, but in the subsoil as well from a lot of all the rains that we've had throughout the much of the year. And finally, a look at the drought monitor where we are right now. All of Texas is drought-free. You see a couple of specks out in West Texas of abnormally dry areas that still have some lingering impacts of drought, but not considered to be drought itself. So this is a really good map to be showing. I know in a lot of the presentations I've been giving over the last 5 years, this is something I've not been able to show, is a clear map of Texas. We've been talking about drought now for like 5 years or so. So that kind of is a review of what the kind of weather we saw here in 2015. So, you know, what's been driving all this crazy weather? Well, part of it is, you know, this Godzilla El Nino. I think all of y'all have heard that term in the news. It's been really turning the weather, not only here, but even across the nation and many parts of the world, kind of upside down. We've been seeing some really crazy weather events, some of them sort of linked to El Nino. One event going on right now, I don't know if y'all heard of the hurricane, which is going on in the Atlantic, the North Atlantic. Did y'all hear that in the news? Hurricane Alex. We're having a hurricane going on in January. This is an extremely rare event. I'm not necessarily blaming that on El Nino, but there are some relationships there that might be related to the El Nino itself. But El Nino has been a big driver in our weather for this year. So I wanted to talk about that. El Nino is still in place, and it's going to have a big influence on our weather probably through the first half of 2015. When I talk about El Nino, I'm referring to this area of the Pacific Ocean between the coast of South America and going westward almost to Australia. We're focusing in on the tropics or the equatorial region. You see that area have circled there in the red. That is a tongue of unusually warm water. These waters formed almost 2 years ago and spread toward the east and continue in place. And recently they have become some of the warmest ever measured out in that area. So this is the El Nino. It's still holding strong, and will probably be here for another few months. I'll get into the timeline on that in just a minute. But right now, it is having a big impact on weather around our area and around the world. This is looking at sea surface temperatures in one region of the Pacific, going back just to a year ago. We're looking at late January on the left-hand side and to the current period on the right-hand side. And you can see how the sea surface temperatures have been steadily rising throughout the year, and they reached a peak sometime around late November, early December, getting up to 3 degrees Celsius above normal. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is temperature anomaly, and that is just phenomenal. It doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you change those water temperatures 3 degrees, it has a big impact on the atmosphere up above. You start to form more thunderstorms and large clusters of thunderstorms. You get a lot of lift or rising motion into the atmosphere, and when you push that air up on that side of the ocean, part of it sinks on the western side and part of it sinks over on the eastern side out into the Atlantic, but it changes the configuration of the jet stream when you do that. And this has been a big driver in the weather pattern beginning last spring and has been with us ever since. In fact, I wanted to show you this graph. It's kind of hard to see. This is looking back in the historical record all the way to about 1950 and looking at the strongest El Niños on record, and those would be those blue peaks you see there. This map was finished, I think, sometime in August. Hasn't really been updated. But what I wanted to show you, if you notice there's a peak, I wish I could point to it on the with a but I can't with the laser. On the very last side, we are now matching 1997 as far as the magnitude of this El Nino. So this came out in the news about, I think, last week. This is now matches as being the strongest El Nino ever. But just because you have the strongest El Nino ever doesn't translate into having the wettest weather ever here in Texas. There is a good relationship for above normal rainfall, but what we found is sometimes these strongest El Ninos aren't always the wettest for us. Sometimes the more weak to moderate El Ninos may be the bigger rainfall producers for our area. Like I mentioned, there is some similarity with 1997 as far as the magnitude of that warm water, and this was a map that was produced by NASA. And you can see, looking on the left-hand side, this is 2015. Notice that big warm tongue like I mentioned to you before. And notice what it looked like in 1997. Very, very similar as far as where they are in the ocean and sort of their magnitude and strength. So knowing that, we would expect that the weather coming up would be very similar to the weather we saw in 1998. From 97, 98 was that very strong El Nino, then it went away. So we might think that same driver that caused the weather conditions in 98 may be present as we go into 2016. Now, there's other things in the atmosphere that are still going to be influencing our weather as well, but El Nino is probably going to be the main driver. Looking ahead at the forecast for what are these sea surface temperatures going to do, what you're seeing up there, all of those individual lines are computer model solutions looking out into the future. On the bottom axis is time. We're looking out all the way onto the right to August, September, October of this year. And where will these traces be at that time, indicating the water temperatures? If you look up in the upper left, we're up at, again, 3 degrees Celsius above normal. But notice all the lines are pointed down toward the bottom. They're indicating that we think this El Nino will peak. It's going to take its time. It's going to slowly weaken and go away. And there's even some traces that are indicating we might get into a weak La Nina by this fall. Now, La Ninas, we don't like those around here because La Ninas tend to kick off drier periods and oftentimes drought. That's, the big drought that we just came out of was kicked off by a La Nina back in late 2010. Now, myself and no forecasters are saying we're going to see a repeat of that. But we are seeing some indications that there is a La Nina possible on the horizon either this fall or maybe even later into 2017, which could mean some drier periods ahead for our region. I did want to show you, let's compare this El Nino, which is the very dark line up there, with the strongest El Ninos that we've recorded in history. Now, I mentioned 97, 98 was the one that's probably the closest, that was similar in magnitude, and that's that tan line, the one that you see right above the very dark line on the left-hand side. You can follow that, what it did. And then you see there's several other years up there, and most of them held strong going January through spring, and then notice almost all the lines trended down. So looking back in history, it's a pretty good guide that this El Nino probably will do about the same thing. It'll weaken over the spring period and may completely go away by the time we get to the summer. So that is pretty important when we put together the weather outlook then for 2016, knowing that we will still see the effects of El Nino probably through the first half of the year. They're going to start going away in the summer. We may be facing a La Nina then by next fall. If not a La Nina, then maybe at least what we call an ENSO neutral neutral or a neutral Pacific. It's not an El Nino or it's not in La Nina. I mentioned before that El Nino is the big driver of our pattern so far, but there have been other features out there, and one of them is what we call the PDO. I don't know if any of y'all have heard this, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. I don't know if any of y'all ever heard that term before. What this refers to is this area I circled off the west coast of the U.S., and you notice it's in yellow there. These are waters that have turned unusually warm and have been in place for about the last 2 years. Many of y'all may have heard the term the big blob, the California blob. I don't know if any of y'all have heard that term. The big blob was in place last year, and this blob of warm water actually contributed to California continuing in drought. It kept most of those storms away from the California coast, and as a result, they really had a very low snowpack last year. But anyway, this blob, if you will, is still sort of in place. So we have a positive PDO. The positive PDO is actually good for our region as far as contributing to rain. So this is still in place. But one other thing that it did do this fall is help contribute to very mild temperatures here across our area. But having that positive PDO in place, that's still a positive for us to get more rain through at least the first half of 2016. The other thing is this term that it really got used last year, the polar vortex. Many of y'all heard of that? You know, we blamed everything on the polar vortex, but the polar vortex is a real meteorological phenomenon, and it really involves an area of low pressure that generally sits over the polar region, and all the air spins around it. Last year, what happened is the polar vortex kind of slipped south to just north of the Great Lakes region, and it allowed a lot of really cold air to come down over the eastern part of the country. We saw some of that as well here. Well, this year, though, the polar vortex has been very strong. It's been sitting right over the pole, and as a result, it's kept all the cold air mostly locked up around the polar region. So if you remember back going into December, and especially around the Christmas period, you remember how warm it was here and even along the East Coast, and everyone was complaining, where's the cold air? It had to do with this polar vortex being unusually strong through November and December, and even into early January. Since that time, the polar vortex has started to weaken. At least the latest observations are showing that. And we've been getting a little dribs and drabs of cool air in here. Nothing really cold, no Arctic outbreaks so far. But colder air is starting to break loose. And I think as we go further into February, our solutions are showing that we were going to get a little more cold air coming into our area in the eastern U.S. because this polar vortex now is starting to break down. It might even move more south toward the Great Lakes region here in the next couple of months. But going back to El Nino, again, I mentioned that's the big driver in the weather. And what we see with El Nino is generally a subtropical jet. I know that's a fancy term, but this is a belt of winds that originate in the tropical region of the Pacific, come in over Mexico and across the southern U.S., tend to bring storms with them. And we have seen that from time to time. We saw that in October and November, a little bit in December, not so much yet in January, but I do think this is going to return. But notice where that green is painted from Southern California all the way across Texas and into the southeastern U.S. That's the typical response of just an average El Nino of wet weather there. This is the rainfall we have seen for the last 60 days. And, you know, I was expecting a little bit better match from what we see in a typical El Nino and what we have seen so far this year, and it really hasn't matched up that well. Yes, the California coast is getting some rain now, thank goodness. They're starting to see their drought get a little bit better, but the focus of the rain has actually been across the middle Mississippi Valley. Notice that area of purple across Missouri and eastern Oklahoma and Arkansas. That's where the big focus of rain has been the last 60 days. Yes, much of Texas has seen some rain, so has the Deep South. So we haven't seen the typical response of an El Nino. So yes, there are other factors out there that are obviously in play this winter they're really changing the weather pattern a little bit from what we'd typically expect from an El Nino. So we got to keep that in mind, that we're probably not going to see just the typical responses from El Nino going forward through the rest of winter and going into spring. By the way, this is the rainfall the last 60 days around Texas. You notice around our area, our rainfall is totaling more or less near normal. We're not screaming wet. We're not screaming dry by any means. Much of Texas is generally on the wet side more than being on the dry side at the current time. So having said that, let's take a look back at some of the response we got from the strongest El Ninos, because this seems to be our biggest driver right now. What was the rainfall we got from the October through March period, looking at just the last 6 strongest El Niños? If you look at Texas and much of the southern U.S., they were wet. Not extremely wet. We weren't, on the extreme right-hand side of that scale, but we were pretty wet. That's the average of what we get. So let's look now then at January, March. Let's break this down though, because now we're in January. We want to see what is spring to early summer going to look like. The January through March with the strong El Niños, notice that Central Texas is colored wetter than normal. So I do think this would be a good guide going forward of what we can expect here for the next couple of months. What about beyond that? March through May actually shows that historically our weather has trended more toward normal as far as rainfall goes. We don't see much anywhere across Texas being extremely wet. So, this kind of goes into the forecast then for this spring that, we will probably be on the wet side, but nothing extremely wet, probably not a repeat of 2015 by any means. I did want to throw this in just to give you all something to think about. I mentioned before the El Nino of 97, 98 seems to be the closest to the El Nino that we're in right now as far as the strength goes. What was the rainfall we saw in March through May of 98, which again was the second portion of that El Nino? It wasn't good. Look how dry it was across Texas. We were actually below normal, about 2 to 4 inches of below normal over that course of time during 98. So we're hoping we don't see a repeat of that. This was June through August in 98, a very dry summer around our area. But again, I did want to stress that El Nino isn't going to be the only thing out there, and our forecasts are not indicating this at this time. So don't get too worried yet. This is a look at very, very late model runs, where this is what we call our National Multi-Model Ensemble. We took 8 different models and ran them independently, then put their results together. What will the precipitation be like here looking out going forward all the way to August? And there's actually some pretty good news. This is a lot different than what I showed you for 98. Notice February up there, the green. Anywhere where you see the greens, this is above normal rainfall. If you happen to see the tans, that is in the below normal rainfall. Notice beginning with February, we're seeing above normal rainfall. We're still seeing slightly above normal rainfall in March. We're seeing slightly above normal rainfall in April. Still slightly above in May, and that's good news because May is typically our wettest month. We're seeing a fairly wet signal in June. And July, we're seeing near normal rainfall. And then August, we do get into some below normal rainfall across our area. And again, this is very, very late model data, taking into account the El Nino and what's been going on in the atmosphere all the way up through early January. So this is some pretty good data here, and it gives us a pretty good idea of what we could expect then for spring going into early summer. As far as temperatures go, you notice that it's painting a signal of below normal temperatures. That's the blue you see up there. Blues correspond with below normal temperatures. The tans or reds would correspond with above normal temperatures. So February looks a little bit below normal. March is also looking a little bit below normal. But as we get into April, we'll probably be near normal. Same story in May. And then as we get into June, we're seeing a trend of going above normal in temperature. July looks pretty hot around our area, as typical, but this is actually looking a little hotter than normal. And August is looking pretty brutal at this point, actually. You notice that red coming down into the northern half of Texas. So the models right now are saying this summer coming up, while our rainfall might be normal, our temperatures are actually going to be above normal. So get ready for a pretty hot summer coming up. This is the official forecast from the National Weather Service. It's putting all of that data together into their outlooks for the next few months, and I'll step through these really quick. Up at the top is their outlook for January, and looking at temperature on the left and precipitation on the right. And you notice they're showing below normal temperatures for our area. Now month to date, we're pretty much near normal, where we're not going in extremes on either side. So we still got some ground to make up if they're going to verify this forecast of below normal temperatures, but we're not as warm as we have been in December. Above normal in precipitation, and right now we're actually a little below normal for January, but we still have 2 weeks to go. We could still make this up, and actually things are looking somewhat wet for the latter part of next week, but this is the outlook for January. Looking ahead to January, February, March, again, a signal for below normal in temperatures. We're not done with winter, and I think as we get into February, we are going to see more cold air coming down, maybe even colder than what we have seen so far. There's a lot of other signals going on in the atmosphere. I'm not going to get into a lot of the detail on that, but winter is far from over, despite the fact that we're getting now toward the second half of January. And the good news is here, too, that above normal precipitation, the green you see up there corresponds with above normal rainfall. Taking this out a little bit further, this is beginning with February, March, and April are centered on March. And then going forward, you notice the signal, the green up there, the signal for above normal rainfall will continue through March, through April. And then as we get to May, you notice how they're starting to pull back and show a clear color up there. At that point, they're not really showing a trend one direction or another. So at that point, I think that's when our weather is going to get a little bit more variable. The models that I showed you before, that ensemble, showed us still slightly above normal into May, and that really could happen. Same thing in June. But from the Weather Service's standpoint, they're going to be a little more cautious and say, you know what, it could go either way. And they're showing the same thing for the summer, which is pretty good. You know, summer, if we can just get even normal rainfall in our area, would be really good. As far as temperatures go, you notice the blue would correspond with below normal temperatures and the tan with above normal. They're showing below normal temperatures for the March, the April time frame. As we get to May, though, we're starting to trend back the other way. We're going to be near normal. And then as we get into the summer months, you notice they're also saying as we get to July and August, we're going to be above normal as well. So there's pretty good confidence that this summer coming up is going to be a pretty hot one, but we still should have some rain around the area. Finally, I did want to mention a little bit about the upcoming hurricane season. I started earlier and talked a little bit about how we've already had our first named storm of the year named Alex. Here it is in mid-January, which is just unbelievable. But, I'm talking about the heart of the season from June going forward all the way through October for our area. And what I'm showing you up here is a map of sea surface temperature anomalies looking at both the Pacific and the Atlantic, but I want to concentrate on the Atlantic itself. This is one clue, just one of many clues that we're seeing of what this next season could hold. If you look at the area from the Gulf of Mexico through the Caribbean and all the way to the coast of Africa, notice all of the yellow showing up there. Water temperatures in the Atlantic right now are way above normal, especially for the month of January. And if we could get a hurricane to develop in the northeastern Atlantic in January, something crazy is going on. But the water temperatures have not cooled off, and I really think that going forward, these warm water temperatures are going to persist in many areas. So I do think that this is going to be one positive factor to having an active hurricane season this year. The other is the fact that we're coming out of El Nino and trending toward a La Nina. And typically when you get in the neutral or the La Nina years, that's when you have a more active hurricane season. And so you match that with the warm sea surface temperatures. I do think that the hurricane season coming up this year is going to be quite active. Now, whether Texas sees a storm or not, no one can predict that. But I do think we're going to see quite a few storms, and Texas is fair game. And not storms, again, not just from the Atlantic or the Gulf. We could see storms coming up from the Pacific as well. We've seen a couple of those here over the last couple of years. But overall, I think this year's hurricane season is going to be a busy one, and may even develop early. I mean, it's already started, but this is sort of a fluke storm. I really don't expect any other activity until we get to maybe sometime late May or going into June. And with that, I've sort of, gives you a flavor of what I'm thinking for this year coming up. Again, a fairly wet spring for our area. I don't see any signs of drought anytime during the spring months. But then as we get toward the summer months, rainfall should start trending down. And we may start turning drier, especially as we get to the second half of next year, going into the fall period, if that La Nina does develop. There's a lot of uncertainty as far as whether it's going to happen or not. But I definitely think the second half of the year is going to be drier than what we're seeing in the first half. I don't see a repeat of the kind of rains that we saw in 2015. I mean, again, that was just sort of off the charts. As far as temperatures go, I think we're going to have a pretty good, late winter going into spring. But then as we get to late spring and summer, I do think the temperatures are going to start trending a lot hotter. And this is going to be a pretty hot summer coming our way.